Hello, everybody. Here we are once again. This will actually be our last proper class. On Thursday, we will, of course, have class, but it will be a review session. I'll talk about the exam, and you guys can ask any questions that you want, and so on. But today's the last class covering new material. And I believe we were here. Yeah, that's what we did. Okay. So we have this aggregate supply, aggregate demand model. And the thing we're supposed to get out of this is, first of all, there's a natural tendency for the economy in the long run to end up back at potential output, back at the normal level of output. And that if output is lower than that, if we're in a recession, eventually inflation expectations will come down and output will go back up. Okay? But that eventually can be very quick or it can be slower. And we'll see today that if we have an expansion, if we have output higher than potential output, so we have higher than the normal level of output, inflation will take off and that will close the output gap and we'll end up back at potential output. So this is what we're supposed to get out of this. So here we are. We have a situation where we're in short-run equilibrium. We're at point A. This is sort of reiterating what's going on before. So the long-run aggregate supply is just sort of the natural long-run tendency of the economy. But in the meantime, we are this short-run aggregate supply. That is, people have set their wage and input prices, contracts, given this level of expected inflation. Right? So this level of expected inflation here. If they get the inflation they expect, they get potential output. But in fact, aggregate demand was low, and therefore output is low and inflation is low. Okay? And so here, any number of things can happen, right? This is what happens in the short run. We get Y1 and we get pi1. This is the level of inflation. Inflation is lower than expected. So what happens then really just depends on what people were expecting, why they were expecting what they were expecting. If they expect aggregate demand to go up, then maybe their expectations stay the same. And maybe aggregate demand does go back up. But assuming aggregate demand is where it is, then if they don't change their expectations, then they're going to keep the same short-run aggregate supply. They're going to make the same wage negotiations, and they're going to keep the same short-run aggregate supply, and they're going to continue to have a recession. Right? Now, again, we're always assuming throughout here that everyone has the same inflation expectations. Both workers and firms have the same expectations of the future. Now, if that's the case, then we have high wage increases, but inflation is low, and so firms are being hurt. Both firms are being hurt, and people who are losing their jobs are being hurt, right? Because output is lower than potential output. So eventually, those people who are getting hurt are going to cop on, and they're going to realize that inflation expectations are too high, and they're going to adjust them down. Okay? And there's kind of two extreme views we can take on how they're going to adjust their expectations of inflation. So here we're assuming aggregate demand is going to stay where it is. One is the one we saw last time, which is adaptive expectations. That is, people just think tomorrow is going to be like today. In which case, they're going to slowly work their inflation expectations down. The expectations for the next period are going to be pi1, so we're going to have a lower short-run aggregate supply, and slowly the recession will work its way out. Okay? And this can be fast if these short-term contracts are quick, or if they're very short-term, or it can be longer if they're 5-year contracts. The speed of this is actually important. The other extreme view is that we have rational expectations. And rational expectations are all the rage in macroeconomics since the 70s. And they're saying that, well, we as economists are not smarter than other people. And in fact, they know their business at least as well as we do. And if this is the way the world works, then they also know just as well as us how the world works. So if we believe that this model is how the world works, and we know it, they should know it too. In which case, they know that if they drop their expectations down to pi1, in fact, they're going to get less inflation than that, right? Because if they drop their expectations to pi1, they're going to get short-run aggregate supply given that pi e is equal to pi1. then they're going to get this level of output and this level of inflation. So they're still going to get less inflation than what they expected. Okay? Because in this case, in this rational expectations world, they actually understand the model. Okay? And because they understand the model, okay, the camera's being weird. Let's see what it's being weird about. Yeah, okay. That's not going to work. It's just going to do its thing. All right. So in this case, they're still being fooled. So what they're going to do is, given that they know everything about the model, is they're going to adjust their expectations so that they're not being fooled. So what they're going to do instead is they are going to adjust their expectations all the way down so that short-run aggregate supply pi E equals now equals pi star, and this is rational expectations. Because if this is true, then we're going to be at this point, and the inflation they get is going to be just equal to the inflation that they expect. Right? And so if they know everything about the model, then, like we do, then they're going to go jump right to there. So if this is the case, then there's really no need for us to try to do anything about a recession, because they're going to fix it really quick, because their expectations are going to adjust really quickly to the long-run equilibrium. And they're just going to go from one year they had a recession, and then the next year it's going to fix itself. Okay? And reality may be somewhere in between, but that's for you to say, right? It's anything is possible because it's all in our head. It's what we expect. On the other hand, we should be reasonable about what we expect, and you know, we may be able to say something systematic about what people expect, but in terms of what's possible, it's just based on people's expectations. Okay? Okay. So long-run equilibrium looks like that. Either that's going to happen really quickly with rational expectations, or maybe it's going to be a bit slower, but eventually we're going to get there. Okay? Now, in terms of and there's lots of realistic things we could put in here to talk about it. And the big debate in macroeconomics really comes down to how quick do you think this kind of thing is? Because if it's really quick and recessions solve themselves very quickly, then really we shouldn't do anything about them, right? Because anything we do is just likely to screw it up, right? It's fixing itself really quickly, just stay hands off. On the other hand, if we think it's going to stick around for a long time, then output will be low for a long time, people will be unemployed for a long time, and if we could speed this up, that might be a good thing, right? And so it's really about how long this thing takes. And people that are, you know, on sort of either camp, on the far extremes of either camp, are really, you know, no, it's going to take a long time, no, it's going to be quick, but the reality is, my opinion is that, and a lot of people's opinion is, that, you know, it's going to be different in different circumstances. Like if you look at the past, sometimes recessions are quite long, sometimes they get fixed quite quickly, because it really depends on how expectations adjust, and that can be different in different situations because it's in our heads. Right? And so sometimes maybe we're going to adjust very slowly, sometimes we're going to adjust pretty quickly. Now in terms of the adjust slowly camp, one reason why it might take a while to adjust, suppose that you had rational expectations and you knew everything about the model, right? And so, and your employer did as well. And you're on a one-year contract, and so you are, you know, you go into the negotiations fully understanding the model, except that now, suppose that not everybody's on the same time schedule. Some people are on a one-year contract, some people are on a 5-year contract, some people's contract doesn't come due for another 6 months, right, in the economy as a whole. In which case, at that point, you can't expect to be all the way back to potential output, because that would involve everybody changing their contracts. But that's not likely to happen because everyone's on a different time frame for their short-term contract. So even though you fully understand the model and you and your employer both have rational expectations, you might not adjust your expectations all the way down to this long-run equilibrium inflation because you know that other firms haven't done that yet. Right? And so it might take a while. Even if everybody has rational expectations, it still might take a while for this to work down because we're not all on the same contract. Okay. Now, let's suppose that we thought that this shift down is going to take a long time. Okay? Might not, but suppose we thought it was likely to take a long time. It's going to be 5 years. We're going to have a recession for 5 years before we get back close to potential output. And during that time, output is going to be low. There's going to be a lot of people unemployed. Lives will be ruined. It's terrible. Is there anything we can do about it? Right? How would we do something about that? Okay? Now, this is a given. No, we're taking as given that we think it's going to be a long time. Not everyone agrees with that. But given that we think it's going to be taking a long time, is there anything we can do? Well, we can try to shift aggregate demand the same way we did before, right? It's still, aggregate demand is still our same C plus IP plus G plus net exports, the same as it always has been. It's still planned aggregate expenditure, same as it was in all those other models. This model takes all those other models and just adds stuff to it. So everything that was going on in those other models still continues to go on here. So in particular, if we wanted to move this along quickly and close this output gap more quickly, we could try to shift that, if I do it in blue, back up to there, or shifting it to the right. By shifting it to the right, then we could close the output gap and we would have a new equilibrium here. We would have Y star, and we could have, now let's call it pi prime. Okay, so this would be Y prime. Okay. And how would we do that? Well, we would do it the same way we did in the other models. We would just try to increase the amount of stuff that was being bought. And we could do that either by increasing G, right? We could have G go up, we could have taxes go down, or we would have money supply goes up, which gives us the interest rate goes down, which gives us, hopefully the real interest rate goes down, which gives us investment goes up, right? So any of these expansionary policies that worked in the other model would work here as well. However, here we see that there's a cost to this policy. And the cost is we're going to end up with much higher inflation, right? We can get to potential output and close the output gap more quickly, but not for free, right? We're giving up this inflation. We're going to have inflation, and it's going to stick around forever at that stage, right? Maybe it's worth it, maybe it's not. It depends on your point of view, and most crucially, how quickly you think short-run aggregate supply would shift down if we left it alone. Right? If it's going to take 1,000 years, maybe we should do something about it. Right? If it's going to take 20 minutes, we should stay well enough alone. Right? And somewhere in between, we got to make the call. Okay. Okay, here's another one. Here we're going to start with a boom. Right, so here we're in a boom. For some reason, we thought inflation was going to be pi 0, but aggregate demand turned out to be higher than we expected. And so we end up at point B with Y1 and pi 1. Okay? Let's do the same exercise we did before. Okay? Let's suppose that we have adaptive expectations. So for this one, we're going to do adaptive expectations, if I can. We can actually, here we go, adaptive expectations. Okay. If we have adaptive expectations, then this is what happens in the first year. We have a boom. That is, inflation is higher than we expect. Who's being helped and who's being hurt here? Well, firms set their wages, firms and workers set their wages with this low level of expected inflation. So the wage increase is equal to pi 0. But in fact, inflation was higher than that, right? Which means that if you're a worker, you are getting paid less in real terms than you expected because the price of everything you buy went up by pi 1, but the price of your labor, your wages, went up by pi 0. So you're not able to afford your rent, you're living in a cardboard box under a bridge, kind of sucks for you. On the other hand, some people that were unemployed probably get a job because of this, because output is high, so it's not all bad news for workers, it depends on who you are. And firms love it because their costs only went up by pi 0, but the price of what they sell goes up by pi 1. Right? So it's very profitable for firms, bad for workers that have a job, that would have had a job anyway, and good for some workers who get a job that might otherwise not have gotten a job. Right? But of course, it involves fooling the existing workers, and so eventually they're going to cop on, and they're going to think, well, pi 0 is obviously a dumb thing to expect in this economy. We should expect higher inflation. Okay? And with adaptive expectations, we're just going to think that tomorrow looks like today, and today is pi 1. So if that's the case, then we get, this becomes pi expected 2 because of the adaptive expectations, right? It doesn't have to. People can expect whatever they want. But because we have adaptive expectations, they expect pi 2, which means we get a new short-run aggregate supply 2, given that pi expected equals pi 1. Right? And then output, y2, goes down. And inflation goes up. This is 2. But again, people are still being fooled, right? Inflation is still higher than they expected. And so inflation is going to, expectations are going to continue to go up. And this is going to continue until we get to the long-run equilibrium, which is all the way where what you get is what you expect, which is here, until we've closed the output gap. So booms are self-correcting as well, right? If we're above potential output, then inflation expectations are going to go up, and the boom will disappear. And this is something that we didn't have in the basic Keynesian model with the cross diagram. Right? Remember, there we could just increase government spending, and output would go up. And we could increase government spending again, and output would go up again. But this isn't going to work anymore, right? Because if we keep doing that, if we shift aggregate demand out like this, output's going to go back down because inflation is going to take off. Because we have a limited capacity to produce stuff, and if government keeps buying stuff, that's just more demand for kind of the same amount of stuff, and so prices are going to take off and close that output gap. Okay, so now we can no longer get any kind of free ride, right? If we're in a boom, whenever we increase government spending, we are going to end up with more inflation. In a boom, we're going to end up with more inflation and the same level of output in the end. Maybe not for a few years, but eventually we're at the same amount of output. And if we're in a recession, we keep increasing government spending. Yeah, we can speed up the return to potential output, but at the cost of inflation. So either way, it's inflationary. We no longer have a free ride by just increasing government spending. There's a cost to it. Okay, anything else I want to say about this? No, I think we're good. Okay. So here is a typical exam question. Actually, it's not quite a typical exam question. I know exams are coming up, so people are near and dear to everyone's heart. But this is one of the more difficult exam questions you could get on this. And I put this up here just so that we can talk a little bit about how to read a theory exam question and how to address it. So here's a question that existed on an old exam way back in the day. And what do we got? We got, starting from long-run equilibrium, if G goes up And we get a bunch of multiple choice because, of course, it's a multiple guess exam, and so you got to guess multiply. And so output inflation will go up permanently. Output inflation will go up temporarily, but then go back down. Output inflation will go up, but then output will go back down, but inflation will stay there. Output inflation will go up, but then output will go back down, but inflation will go even higher. Output will go up, inflation will go down temporarily. I'm dizzy. Are you not dizzy? Like, what the hell? And so, like, how are you supposed to deal with something like this? Okay, if you see something like this? Well, the first thing that you're supposed to do is you're supposed to identify what kind of question is it. Is it a question about theory? Is it a question about measurement? What's the question on about, right? And I know a lot of people have trouble coming to grips with reading the questions and understanding the questions, so this is your important first step. You've got loads of time on the exam. There's only 30 questions. There's 2 hours. You got loads of time. So you have a question. What sort of thing is it asking about? What subject matter in this course is this question on about? Okay? And we can see that it is a theory question rather than an empirical question because it is asking what's going to happen. And that is always a theory question. Right? If something changes, what's going to happen is not what has happened in the past, what does the data tell us about what happened? No, so predict, make a prediction. And so that's a theory question. So now we know it's theory, so we don't need to know we don't have to like go directly to GDP accounting or any of that. We're saying, okay, theory, what kind of theories have we got? Well, we've got a theory with the Keynesian cross diagram. We've got a theory with money supply, money demand. We got that. And what else? Do we got anything else? We got this, right? That's it. That's all we got. We got the 3 theories, 3. So we got to guess which one it is. And there's not a lot about money going on. We got this G floating around here, so it's not probably money supply, money demand, right? Because that had nothing to do with G. And we got nothing going on with money or interest rates or anything in any of these answers or in the question. So it's probably not money supply, money demand. And so that leaves the Keynesian cross diagram and aggregate supply, aggregate demand, right? And then, okay, we need a clue. Which one of those is that? And one thing we know about, well, I don't know, one thing you should know about the Keynesian cross diagram is it's really a short-run model, right? Anything that it says only counts while prices are fixed, right? So all this stuff, this long-run equilibrium, and we got a bunch of stuff, well, things are going to change, and then they're going to go up for a little while and back down, up and down, all these things. They're all very kind of time-oriented. And the question is time-oriented. In Keynesian model, there's no such thing as long-run equilibrium. There's only short-run equilibrium. That's all we got, right? And so it's not the Keynesian model. By process of elimination, this is on about aggregate supply, aggregate demand. Okay, so we got aggregate supply, aggregate demand. Good for us. Now, obviously, as your economics teacher who's been doing this for 30 years, I can just pick out the answer like that, right? No, I don't. I have no clue. I got no clue. I've not memorized this stuff. For a number of years, I still can't remember which one it is. That's not the way you do it. The way you do it is not because you memorize what the answer is. The way you do it is because you say, okay, it's aggregate supply, aggregate demand. I should sit down and I should draw the little diagrams. That's what you're meant to do. You're just meant to take the back of the page, draw the little diagrams, and figure it out. You're not meant to know it. I don't know it. You don't know it. None of us know it. The diagrams are there to help us think. They're a tool for thinking. We should use them and think. So that's what we're meant to do. So how do we do that? Let's see, do I have it on the next page? No. Okay. So we're starting from long-run equilibrium. We're supposed to figure out what happens when G goes up. So the first thing we need to do is we need to draw what does long-run equilibrium look like. So we got Y, we've got inflation, we've got Y star, long-run aggregate supply, we've got an aggregate demand, and short-run aggregate supply. I don't know why I made that red, but there it is, it's red. Okay? And there we are in long-run equilibrium. So that gives us the first part of the question, right? Starting from long equilibrium. And now we're told G goes up. And we're supposed to figure out what happens in the short, medium, and long run, right? Okay. So we're told that G goes up. And we know that this is equal to C plus I plus G plus net exports. And G has gone up. So this aggregate demand is going to shift to the right. Let me do this in blue. Shifting to the right when our G goes up. Okay? So now, at that point, we have a new equilibrium, short-run equilibrium, Y1, pi 1, where this was pi 0. So in the short run, we have Y went up, inflation went up. So we go back to our answers and we see if we can eliminate any of them, right? Maybe we don't know what happens in the long run. Maybe we forgot that bit. But if we can get this far, we can maybe eliminate a few of the answers, right? So output and inflation go up permanently. Maybe. We have output goes up, inflation goes up in the short run. So maybe A is correct. Output and inflation will go up temporarily, but then go back down. Possible, right? It's consistent with what we have so far. Output and inflation will go up, but then da-da-da-da-da, possible. Output inflation will go up, but da-da-da-da-da. That's possible. E, output will go up and inflation will go down. This is wrong because inflation went up. Right? So we can eliminate E based on what we have so far. Okay? Process of elimination. Okay, so it's either something A through D. So what happens next? What happens next is now inflation is higher than what people expected, right? This was inflation expected. And so people are going to revise their expected inflation upward. And in the long run, they're going to keep doing it until the output gap closes. And so we're going to keep going. Short run aggregate supply eventual. Until short run aggregate supply is going to shift upward, maybe slowly, maybe quickly, we don't know. But eventually it's going to go back and close the output gap. And so in the end, we're going to get inflation eventual and so what happens is first output goes up and then it goes back down. And what happens to inflation is that first it goes up and then it goes up some more. Right? So we go back. Output and inflation will go up permanently. That's plausible. We've got that, right? Well, no, but not output. Output goes up and then it comes back down, so A is wrong. Right? Inflation goes up and stays up. In fact, goes even higher. But output goes back down, so we can eliminate A. Output inflation will go up temporarily, but then go back down. That's true of output, but it's not true of inflation. Inflation goes even higher. Output and inflation will go up, but then output will go back down, but inflation will stay there. Depending on your definition of stay there. Output inflation will go up, but then output will go back down, but inflation will go even higher. D is better than C, so D is the correct answer. Okay? The important thing here is that first, you're identifying that it's a theory question. Then you're identifying what theory, right? We don't have 100 theories to deal with here, so it's just, you got your 3, take your pick. Right? So this is clearly an aggregate supply, aggregate demand question because there's a notion of time. And then you are meant and expected to draw out the graphs. You're not supposed to know the answer. You're supposed to figure it out from the graphs. Okay? Okay. How are we doing? Okay. Yeah, it looks like a mess. All right. The one other thing I want to do while we're here is to talk about how we get out of long-run equilibrium in the first place. And it has to be because something unexpected happens. Right? If we're expecting everything that happens, we're always going to be on potential output. We're always going to be in long-run equilibrium. So it has to be that something happened that we didn't expect. And there's kind of 2 ways that something could happen that we didn't expect. Aggregate demand could be somewhere we didn't expect, or aggregate supply could be somewhere that we didn't expect. And these, in the jargon, these are called shocks. That is, we expected aggregate demand to be someplace, but it was actually someplace else. We're shocked. And that's a shock. It's an unexpected thing that happened. When we were setting our contracts, we knew there were risks in the world, but we didn't know what was going to happen. Then when it happens, that's called a shock. And we're not necessarily shocked, but it's a thing that we didn't take into account, or we didn't know yet that happened. And so the aggregate demand isn't the aggregate demand that we expected. Okay? And so we might have aggregate demand be higher or lower than we expected, and that would cause a recession. So our canonical story about a recession is that Y inflation, Y star, short run aggregate supply, aggregate demand expected. We think there's going to be a situation like that, but in fact, aggregate demand is here. The actual aggregate demand. Because, for example, we set our labor contracts, and then people become pessimistic about the future. And so they're cut back on their consumption, right? And so aggregate demand is lower than we expected when we set our contracts. And therefore, we end up in a recession. This would be a negative demand shock. But we could also have a positive demand shock where aggregate demand is higher than we expected. Okay, perfectly reasonable. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Here we got demand shock. That's a positive demand shock there. We thought it was going to be aggregate demand 1, but in fact, people were optimistic about the future. They consumed more than we expected, and aggregate demand is higher than expected. We end up in a boom and accelerating inflation. Okay? And eventually that will close. Okay? The other possibility is supply shocks, where aggregate supply isn't where we thought it was going to be. And this is a huge area of literature. Unfortunately, this is not a great model to talk about supply shocks. They're important, they're a thing. People got Nobel Prizes for studying them and all that. But for this class, we will not be looking at supply shocks at all. Okay? And the reason is because a supply shock can either be temporary or permanent. Right? And if it's temporary, it's going to shift short-run aggregate supply. If it's permanent, it's going to shift long-run aggregate supply. Right? You can imagine that oil prices in the world go up. OPEC does a thing. Oil prices in the world go up. That could be a temporary thing, shifting short-run aggregate supply. Or it could be a long-term thing, that for the next 50 years, oil prices are going to be high, and that will shift long-run aggregate supply. Okay? And in this model, in the story we've been telling, it's really hard to tell them apart. And any question I ask, the answer that you're going to get depends very much on whether you think it's short run or long run, and whether people in the model think that it's short run versus long run. And so it's not really a super good way to, you can make it fit and you can tell interesting stories, but in terms of questions that I could ask and reasonable objections to those questions that could be asked, it's not really the model to use. And in fact, that people that think that supply shocks are important don't typically use this model as their way of talking about them. So I just want to say that they are important, like predicting the cost situation in the world is a thing. It can cause recessions, but this is not the model to talk about them. So there's a bunch of stuff on supply shocks in the book. You can safely ignore all of that stuff. I will not ask you a supply shock question on the exam. Okay. Now that's all our actual material for the course, but I want to go back briefly while we have time. Yes, we have time. And talk about, just do one question on money, which I left off just because I wasn't sure whether we'd have time. So we're going back a chapter here. Can we get that to actually show? Yes, there we go. Aha, beautiful. Okay. So this is a question, a sort of a typical-ish question about money. It is, again, one of the harder questions. It's not one of the easier questions about money. Like, what is the medium of exchange is kind of a simple question, but this is one of the harder questions. It involves you knowing a bunch of different stuff to answer it. And so a lot of students, I find, have troubles with this kind of question because they don't even know where to start. And so let me work you through it so that you know where to start. There's a million ways I can ask a question like this, but just so you have an idea how it relates to the material. Okay, so we're given the required reserve ratio is 10%, and the desired reserve ratio is 20%. Banks have 10 billion in reserves, and 5 billion in cash is held by the public. What is the money supply? Okay, so we're supposed to figure out the money supply in this story. What do we have on the next page? Okay, yeah. So how do we figure this out? Hey, let me start actually here. What is the money supply? So the first thing to notice this is that we're supposed to figure out the money supply. And so what is the money supply? Well, it's going to equal bank balances plus cash. Right? And this is the crucial thing. Right? So the cash held by public in this particular one, we're told that 5 billion is held in cash by the public. So that bit is easy. But we have to figure out how much people hold in their bank account, right? Because this is how we defined the money supply, to include the bank account balances. And that's why all this stuff about the reserve ratios and reserves and all that is relevant, because we need to include what people have in their bank accounts as part of the money supply, right? Okay, so all we have to do is figure out what are people's bank balances. And unfortunately, they didn't tell us people's bank balances because the professor's a sadistic bastard. And so we just don't know that. And so we have to figure it out. Right? We're given a bunch of clues, and we got to follow those breadcrumbs and put them together. And this is why this is a nice sort of question from a professor's point of view, because in one question it tests a whole bunch of different stuff, right? It tests, do you understand how the banking system works? Do you understand that money is cash and bank balances? And can you put those things together? Okay. So how do we figure out what bank balances are? Okay, how do we do it? Well, the first thing we do is look at these reserve ratios. The required reserve ratio is 10%, and the desired reserve ratio is 20%. So here, the required reserve ratio is totally irrelevant, right? Because that's just saying you have to hold at least 10%, but they want to hold 20%. So the fact that we require them to hold 10% is irrelevant, right? Now, it could be that it was the other way around, right? If the required reserve ratio was 50%, and they wanted to hold 20%, well, they couldn't hold 20%. They'd be required to hold 50%. And then 50% would be the important one. Okay, so we're given those two pieces of information, and it is up to you to figure out which one is relevant. In this case, the required reserve ratio is irrelevant, and the desired one is relevant because that's higher. Whichever one is higher is going to be the one that matters, right? Because it's a minimum requirement. It's not a maximum or a demand, right? You just have to have that minimum. So here they're going to hold 20% in reserves. And we're told that they have 10 billion in reserves, and they're holding 20% in reserve. So what does that mean? So for every €1 that's in deposits, remember we're trying to figure out deposits, for every €1 that people have deposited, they hold 20% and loan out the rest. So loans are 4 times reserves. So for every euro of reserve deposits, deposits are 5 times as much, right? Because there's 5 20s in 100, and they've held 20% of it in reserve, so deposits must be 5 times that, right? So if we say it another way, one deposit gives you 20 cents in reserve, right? And so if I multiply both sides by 5, we get 5 deposit gives you 1 reserve. So for every 1 in reserve, you have 5 euros in deposits. And we are told that they have 10 billion in reserves. So if I multiply both sides by 10, we get 50 deposits gives you 10 reserves. So it must be that they have 50 in deposits, right? Because they kept 20% of that in reserve, and their reserves are 10 billion. So deposits are 50 billion. So the total money supply is deposits plus cash. 50 plus 5, the total money supply is 55 billion. Okay. You will notice a couple things about this question is you need to know a fair amount of little bits and pieces and put them all together. Right? You need to know how the banking system works. You need to know the desired reserves versus required reserves. And there's many ways that I could ask this, right? I could give you the amount in reserves. I could give you the amount that they loaned out, which is what? 80% of this 5 billion. They loaned out 4 billion. I'm sorry, 10 billion. The amount they loaned out is 40 billion, and the amount they have in reserve is 10 billion, right? Lots of ways I could give you this information, and then you have to figure out what the money supply is. I could give you the money supply and ask you to figure out one of the other pieces of information, right? Lots of different ways. Keep your wits about you on the questions, but this is the basic idea. Okay, that is the course. We will, of course, meet Thursday. Bring your questions. Bring loads and loads of questions. I would like to be here for hours answering your questions, hopefully. Yeah, and see you Thursday.